Hello everybody, Thomas here, and welcome back to SFF180. It is a very, very dark and stormy Monday afternoon. I appreciate you joining me. I am at long last delivering unto you a much, much delayed episode of the BookTube SFF Babbles. Been very, very behind on these. In this episode, going to be talking about where to start science fiction. Entry-level science fiction for the noob reader, right? Now that's great. It is a subject on which a great many people have differing opinions. I find that science fiction, well, let me put it this way. If you're watching this video right now, obviously you're going to be one of two different types of people. You are someone who is not a very experienced SF reader. You haven't really read much or maybe any SF. Maybe you've read a bunch of fantasy and you're curious about SF, where to hop on board. Or you are somebody who has read some science fiction, maybe a little bit, maybe quite a lot, and you're looking for some titles and some suggestions because perhaps you have a curious friend who's interested in getting into the genre, and you're looking for ways to sort of bring them on board, you know, some ideas of books that would be good and accessible to them. The thing about science fiction, and I guess the reason why this is such a widely argued topic, you know, how to go about it, is that unlike fantasy, well, science fiction just isn't quite as accessible to a new reader as fantasy is. Fantasy deals in very, very familiar tropes that we are brought up with, you know, from childhood pretty much. From all of the fairy tales and the bedtime stories we hear as little kids. And, you know, we get the basic concept of good versus evil, princes, princesses, kings and queens, and dragons, and magic wizards, and pots of gold, and quests to find the sword or what have you. These are things that are just sort of inculcated in our brain. They're very familiar tropes by the time, you know, we're becoming readers of our own. And so in that regard, it's quite easy to bring people into epic fantasy. And you know, you can give anyone, 200 years from now, you'll be able to hand anybody a copy of The Hobbit, and they can read it and get it, right? And of course, while fantasy as a literary genre has matured, and so you have modern writers like, you know, like Erickson and Abercrombie and Scott Baker and, you know, some of the grimdark guys, you know, the people who are trying to introduce moral ambiguities into the genre. You know, for the most part, it's still very easy to bring people in. Science fiction, not so much. Science fiction, literary science fiction, it has its own language, and it appeals to a fan base that, to be perfectly honest, is, or at least has been for many years, very insular and very clannish. Literary SF novels tend to be idea stories, they're speculative fiction, they examine and extrapolate upon concepts. But one thing that I think is happening in science fiction right now, which is good, is that there is this broadening now of the audience base for literary science fiction. New voices, diverse voices, more people from different backgrounds and different life experiences are coming into the genre and opening it up, and they're sort of breaking it out of, you know, the form in which it has existed for, you know, 80 years or what have you, making it thereby more accessible for the current generation of readers to get into. Now, what I'm not going to be doing in this video, and I'm sorry if this is a big disappointment to a lot of people, but it's not just going to be a big listicle of like 1 to 10, you know, here's your reading list, go read those, right? If you're looking for that particular kind of list, well then check out tomorrow, because I'm doing my next BookTube SFF Babbles video, which will be the Overlooked SF episode. And so if you want some specific title suggestions of cool stuff to read, that'll be there. I am going to mention some titles though, some specific titles in the course of all of this. But I'm mainly going to be suggesting methods by which either you can work yourself in or help a friend work themselves in to science fiction readership. One of these, of course, is not to ignore the wide, wonderful world of movies and TV and games, of media fandom. Movies and TV are your friend if you're a literary SF fan. This is something that I think was very different from the attitude that existed when I was a kid and I was just starting to go to cons, you know, literary SF cons, you know, nothing like Dragon Con or Comic Con or anything like that. These would have been mostly just small regional conventions where the focus was on literary science fiction. The guests of honor were always writers. Star Trek conventions were like their thing. off in their little universe, but literary SF conventions were very much their own thing. And back then, and I don't know to whatever degree people like took this sort of thing that seriously. Maybe it was just kind of a friendly batting back and forth. But there was very much this kind of either you're a true fan, right, which means you read books, or you're like a media fan, in which case you're the great unwashed, and you're kind of beneath all the rest of us. And yeah, like I said, I don't know how many people took that all that seriously. Like to the degree that there was like actual, shunning going on or anything like that. But it was still an attitude that was present. Probably similar to the way in which, PC gamers like to snipe at console gamers, right, today. It's that sort of thing. If you take that kind of thing seriously, then it turns into fan policing. And fan policing is the douchiest thing ever, right? There's no right or wrong way to be a fan of something. And I think specifically in using movies and television, the unclean, the media out there for the middle brows, right? No, this is absolutely perfectly the best way to get new readers on board with literary science fiction, because if you are interested in science fiction at all, obviously you have been exposed to it at some point in your life through a different media, through movies, TV, games, what have you. You're just not reading it yet, but maybe you'd like to. If you're that fan, take, for example, Star Wars novels, right? A lot of Star Wars novels out there. Star Wars fans love Star Wars. They go on, they read the expanded universe novels. Well, quite a lot of these novels have been written by writers who are respected, established names in literary SF already, right? Guys like Timothy Zahn have written Star Wars novels. Martha Wells, Karen Travis, Alan Dean Foster, written quite a few Star Wars novels. Christine Catherine Roosh, right? William Dietz, K.W. Jeter, like mostly known for cyberpunk stuff. He's written some Star Wars. Vonda N. McIntyre, Michael P. QB McDowell, hard SF writer, mostly from the 80s, 90s, wrote some Star Wars stuff. And a lot of these writers have also written in other like media franchise tie-ins, right? Star Trek, for example. An approach to take to someone who is, for example, reading lots of Star Wars novels is to tell them, hey, you dig Timothy Zahn's, Heir to the Empire and all of his expanded universe Star Wars stuff? Well, check out his original stuff. Check out Night Train to Raguel. Check out Angel Mass or the Icarus Hunt or the Cobra, military SF novels that, he did back in the 80s and 90s. Whole vast library of stuff that guy has written. You like Karen Travis's Republic Commando novels? Go read her Weshar series. There's 6 of those. So somebody's a Doctor Who fan? Doctor Who novels have been written by guys like Stephen Baxter and Alistair Reynolds. Alistair Reynolds has written a Doctor Who novel, for the love of God, right? There you go. Get your Doctor Who fan friends into reading Alistair Reynolds, the Revelation Space Trilogy. And now, of course, another thing that is happening is that Hollywood, film and television industry, are starting to look more and more at literary science fiction, at popular science fiction novels, and they're getting the rights to those things. They're adapting them either to cinema or to TV, usually to miniseries, our full-length series. That's going on a lot right now. We've already got The Expanse, which has had its first full season. The adaptation of the James S.A. Corey, super popular space opera series. The Man in the High Castle, Philip K. Dick classic, is an Amazon Prime miniseries. Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End was a 3-episode series. That got some mixed reaction. But right there, you can see a way to plug a new reader into literary SF, right? Oh, you like the Expanse miniseries? Go read the damn books. I mean, there's 5 of them. They're pretty great. And you know what? If you like those, you like the Expanse novels, you like Leviathan's Wake, well, lucky you. Here's Chasm City by Alistair Reynolds. Here's Down Below Station by C.J. Cherry. Here's This Alien Shore by C.S. Friedman. Here's Shards of Honor by Lois McMaster Bujold, right? You can springboard directly into all of these things, right? You start with the popular stuff that the mass media is making very popular, and then you move into the deep cuts. And to be perfectly honest, I think that this is a much better, and I think will be a much more successful approach to take for a new science fiction reader than just dropping all the classics into their laps, right? I mean, yes, reading the SF classics is a good thing to do, and can be a very entertaining thing to do as well. It's a good thing to do if you want to be a well-rounded reader, right? If you want to be somebody who is, not just, you're not just reading your favorites, but you have at least a broad education in the genre's history, so then that you can partake in that conversation whenever it comes up, right? Either online, or if you're hanging out with friends, or if you're at a convention or something like that. It's a good thing to do. Not necessarily, a way that I would suggest you've got to employ that to get people into SF. Now, as I mentioned, right, when I was rattling off that list of film and TV adaptations, yes, some of those are established SF classics, right, like Childhood's End. I forgot to mention that there is another series being produced based on Frederick Pohl's Gateway. But it used to be the case, again, when I was a kid and going to these conventions, and I'd sit and I'd watch these panels, and this would be a topic that was common, right? Where do you start? Where do you start somebody on SF? And one answer that would always come up, inevitably come up, would be, well, give them the Heinlein Juveniles, right? Just there, the Heinlein Juveniles. That's what I started reading, and that's what you should start reading too. Well, it's 2016 now, right? So we're definitely in a different generation where that's concerned. But I think even when I was a teen, the Heinlein Juveniles were beginning their slide into, these are classics, you read them for maybe historical interest, but they're not necessarily going to be books that speak to you, speak to your experience, right? In fact, they're a fine example of how science fiction, ironically, has the capacity to become dated much more than other examples of genre fiction, like detective stories or fantasy or what have you, right? Science fiction writers try to predict the future, and sometimes they get it kind of close, but they don't always. And do you remember how we were all supposed to have jetpacks now and be going to vacations on the moon and stuff like that? And in the Heinlein Juveniles, you've got these boys, and they usually were boys because they were boys' stories. Science fiction was considered a boys' genre back then, and for many years, right? It's just recently that tide has been turning. So you'd have his boys off in like Astro Space Cadet Training School, but they'd be doing their math homework with slide rules, right? So here you have science fiction writers in the 1950s are predicting all of these great advances in space travel, but they could never figure out the pocket calculator. They never guessed that, right? And God knows what they would think about iPhones. Another story I can tell you. I'm just full of these long-winded, digressing stories, so just deal with it, all right? I have a good friend here in town who is part of the SF community. He's pretty well established. He's one of the big, like, Smoth type guys. He founded Armadillocon 30 some odd years ago. He's like a walking repository of SF history in his brain. He reads like a demon. I just can't, like 250, 300 books a year is average for him. I don't know how he does it. He just does. Very jealous of his reading throughput. But he, for a while, was a proprietor of his own SF and mystery bookstore, little indie bookstore here in town, downtown Austin, through like the late 90s, early 2000s, called Adventures in Crime and Space. And he had a regular customer, older guy, came in one day, and he was looking for something for his nephew. His nephew was about to have his 12th birthday. And what he picked up, and Brock will be amused by this, what he picked up for his nephew were the E. Doc Smith Lensman novels, right? This is like space opera from like before World War II, I think. It's just old school stuff, right? He comes back a few weeks later. And the poor man is crestfallen, right? Because he's given his nephew the books, and his nephew reads them. And the kid hates them, right? Just did, like, what is this? Couldn't understand why anybody would like them. And the old boy is just very, very sad. He says, I don't get it. These books when I was 12, just changed my life, right? And Willie holds up a finger and says, yeah, well, let me stop you right there, right? When you were 12. Now, how many decades ago was that, right? Your nephew, in this day and age, he's carrying around in his hip pocket more advanced technology than Doc Smith ever saw in his life, right? It's a different world. So this is why I'm not down with the whole just dump a bunch of classics in somebody's lap. Yeah, even if the classics might happen to be good books on their own, and that's not always the case, right? I mean, it's not, just because something is a classic doesn't actually mean it's any good. So what would your suggestions be in terms of getting new readers into literary science fiction? Let me know in the comments. Also, What were your books? What were your first SF books that you read and liked that hooked you? Let me know that as well. But I hope this was helpful. I hope it wasn't too rambly and too vague for the rest of you. Again, tune in tomorrow when I'll have my Overlooked SF BookTube SFF Babbles episode if you want some more specifics, some more direct recommendations of titles. But otherwise, I hope this gave you food for thought, if nothing else. And if you enjoyed watching, please hit that like button, share the video far and wide with your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe. That's how SFF180 grows as a channel, and I have been very, very grateful for all of the recent channel growth. All right, so until I see you guys next time, happy reading.